we are blessed. We know how to do this. We're wandering around in the dark, and somebody walks over and says, here's a map. You understand? If you do this, you can get out of this. That's where we are. This isn't complicated. We know how to do this. We have a picture. It's difficult to locate very abruptly, but you've seen the picture of George Washington in the boat crossing the Delaware. And we see it all the time as an archaic, it's a picture that is in all the history books and all. Let me just tell you a little bit about that picture. That is, that in the beginning of 1776, they began to form an army to defend our country, and they named George Washington the head of it. They said, we don't have any money for you, George, but people have a heart for freedom, and you, with proper leadership, you'll put it together. And an estimated 25 to 45,000 men took their guns and came out to support the army. And he began in New York, up in New England, and he was defeated in Boston, and then he was defeated in New York, and then he escaped across. And finally, it's now December, Christmas time of 1776. He's attempting to do something that's never been done in the history of mankind. He wants to form a country just based upon an idea that God had made man and that man had a right to rule himself. Nobody had ever done it. He didn't have any financial support. He's taking on the largest army in the world, the most powerful military force in the world. The United States at this moment, after Obama, has 183 ships in the United States Navy. There were 600 British ships blockading the eastern seaboard, just to give you a concept of how this guy's doing. He's down to 7,500 men, of which only 2,400 can stand. The others are too sick and they're freezing on the ground, and they're hanging around for one reason. Because next week, on January 1st, their enlistments are up, and then they can go home. And the only reason they're staying there is they're not going to desert, as the others have all summer long. They're not going to desert coming this far. They're going to stay there for a while. So George Washington's prayer partner comes down from New York, and he says, we got to have a victory. Got to have a victory of some sort. We got to do something. And they pray about it, and while they're contemplating it, George Washington writes a letter to his cousin who's running his farm back at Mount Vernon, and he says, I'll probably be home soon. I fear this thing is about up. They've had no victory. They've been destroyed. They have no hope. And they decide that they are going to pray. And let me just see if I can find something here. On December 23rd, Thomas Paine wrote this: "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will in this crisis shrink from the service to his country. But he that stands with it now deserves the love and thanks of all men and women. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered. But we have this consolation that with us, that the harder the conflict, the more glorious the triumph. What we obtain too cheaply, we esteem too lightly. It is dearness only that gives everything its value. Heaven knows how to put a proper price on its goods. And it would be strange indeed if so celestial an article as freedom should not be highly rated." On December 24th, George Washington had that read to his troops in Pennsylvania. He said, "Men, we're out of food and ammunition, and this is about it. But we're going to pray. And we're going to go down and we're going to cross this river, the Delaware, because in Trenton, right across the river, are a group of Hessian soldiers that are paid for by the British, and they have adequate supplies of food and ammunition. And what we're going to do is we're going to march down there at nighttime, we're going to cross the Delaware, and we're going to attack at dawn." And the watchword that my assistant here has come up with is that it will be victory or death. This is it. And so they began the 2,400 that could, they began to march. And just like Katrina hit or something, an unbelievable snowstorm hit. And it tore the shoes apart that were made of leather, and they disintegrated. So they took burlap and wrapped them around their feet. And they said you could follow the soldiers by the blood in the snow. They try to cross the Delaware, which is all choppy and freezing, and they're not able to do it. They come daylight, 2/3 of them are not across yet. That means they're going to have to attack in broad daylight. But they continue to do it. I'll just jump to the bottom line is, they have a victory. They capture all of the supplies. Over 200 and some are killed. They capture over 800 soldiers. One fellow that was wounded, James Monroe, it was hit in an artery, which is fortunately because it began to spurt blood. They began to clog it up so he could become the 4th president of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, 19-year-old assistant to George Washington, is there. James Madison, that 21 years old, that 11 years later would become known as the father of the Constitution of the United States. The only people that they lost only 2 lives, only 2, froze to death on the march. And because of that victory and that painting, a hope and an encouragement went throughout. That's what leadership does. And people began to enlist, over 50,000 new enlistments. They had the supplies, and you know what happened. That little place, that little idea has created more wealth in the previous 200 years than all of mankind throughout all recorded history. It's become the lighthouse for the gospel, the place that people hope to be able to escape to. It protects life. So if a Jew could be chased from all over the planet, if he can just get under the canopy protection of that flag, he could be safe. That was all done from those people who had no hope. You talk about just an idea. You and I have a reputation of 230 years of success. We know this works. It's the envy of the rest of the world. Every day that an American gets up to work, he produces 20% more than the next highest competitor in British or Germany. This nation is the strongest economically, the strongest militarily, the strongest politically. We know that this works, and we're sitting around here twiddling our thumbs like, oh, isn't this terrible? I don't know what we're going to make. Nonsense. We know how, we own this place. We know how to do it. And so, let's go back to principles. We'll walk through these quickly in just a couple of moments, and you will understand. There has to be, who do we choose now to lead? Who do we choose on our school board and our city council and all? And God said, here's what you do. Somebody that does not think that he's God, but recognize that I'm God. So that's the first thing. So how do you feel about God? Well, God said a banana, and God's this, and God's that. Okay, fine. You're finished because you don't know where God is. So God said, somebody who knows me. Now, if they know me, then they understand the standard, which is the next thing, which is truth. And why did God say you have to start with me? Because there has to be a starting point. We go across here to a field, and we say we're going to build a building. You cannot build the building until you do one thing first. You have to go down over and drive a stake. There has to be a starting point, someplace. Now, once you've done that, then you can lay out the program. But if not, if everybody's just going to put the footers wherever they feel like it, and there's no reference point, the thing is going to be chaos. But there has to be a starting point once you do it, and that's God or truth, same thing. That's the true corner. Now, let us suppose you lay the footers and you build the first floor. And then somebody goes out at night and they move it about 6 inches. So that the guy comes in the next day to start putting on the first floor, he's about 6 inches off. The whole thing starts to fall apart. So that's why we can't have your idea and my idea and collectively, well, what's good for you is good. No. God says there has to be a truth. And truth is in Him. Now, let me try to make this clear, because when I was growing up, I heard all this. And how does it actually, when God is truth, what does that mean? It says the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Unless you have the reference point, without a measuring rod, there could be no measurement. And if the measuring rod is not solid, then there can be no measurement. So he says we have to have this truth. And what is the significance of the truth? I mentioned last night that when truth reveals error, let's hit it one more time. Truth does not fear error, but error cannot tolerate truth. Why? Because truth overcomes error. So, you're prosecuting a fellow for stealing an ATM machine. And the attorney gets up on his behalf and says, why, he wouldn't think of doing such a thing. Why, he was out in Portland, Oregon, having dinner with his sister, and here's the receipts from what they were in the restaurant. And you don't care what she says, because when she's finished, you're going to show a security cam of him driving his pickup up to the ATM machine. And it's going to show him putting a chain around the ATM machine. And it'll have his face as he leans over the camera, and the fingerprint as he pushes the buttons. And the truth will overcome the error such that the only way she can succeed, she has to prevent the presentation of truth. Your Honor, I object. I object. Well, we don't know who had to. I object. Why? Because truth overcomes error. Truth does not fear error. You stand up and say anything you want to say. You say God is a flower and God is, you say all you want. But that's why a little 90-pound female weakling cannot stand on a college campus telling truth. Why? Because the truth overcomes the error. That's why they can't have one conservative professor on a college campus. Let me explain that. There's anybody who's taken psychology has studied this. It's in virtually all the psychology books about where they have a classroom of students, and on the blackboard they have a big round circle or a ball. One is blue and one is red. And they tell everybody in the classroom, now when I ask you what color these are, you're supposed to say they're both red, they're both red, they're both red. All right? Everybody agrees. So then they would bring in one person, and he would be the control, and they would sit in there. And they would go around, well, they're both red, yeah, they're both red, they're both red. When they got to the control person, more than 4 out of 5, 85% of those people said, yeah, they're both red, and everybody agreed they were all red. Then they did this. The second time, about the third or fourth person in, they put one person, that said it's going to be blue. And so they bring in the control person. They're both red, they're both red, they're both red. No, they're not. That one on the left is blue. They're both red, 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 they're red. The control person, the numbers were perfectly inverted. 85% of the people agreed with the one guy that stood up. Just one person speaking absolutely destroyed it. Why? Because truth overcomes error. It only happens every time. And so that is why they go to such great effort to do away with truth. That's why they hate us. Jesus said, look at his disciples, they don't hate you. They hate me. You understand that? I'm truth. One more example. I was driving down the road, and I heard on the radio that they said that President George W. Bush had said that Al-Qaeda was no longer a threat. And everybody was just all right. And the second I heard that, I thought, why in the world would he say that? And they cut away to de Villepin, who was foreign minister for France. And he said, well, I don't know why the President of the United States is so out of touch that he would say that Al-Qaeda is no longer a threat, because Al-Qaeda is a threat. And it was the news. I heard it over and over and over, and riding around in the car, heard it on the news, heard it all day long. It was a lead story that night. But one newspaper told the story the next day on the front page. Do you remember that when George Bush was President of the United States, they had a deck of cards, 52 cards, and he had the pictures of the major Al-Qaeda leaders. And so he's finished this press conference in the Rose Garden, and he turns to go back in the White House, and somebody said, how is your deck of cards coming? And he stopped and turned, and he said, well, of the 52, 42 of them are either dead or incarcerated. Either way, they're no longer a threat, and turned and walked back in. The Washington Times, one newspaper, put a block on the front page of the paper in which it has the entire quote. Of the 52, 42 are incarcerated or dead. Either way, they are no longer a threat. Underneath it had the New York Times article where it says George Bush says of the leader of the leadership of Al Qaeda they are no longer a threat. Wow. Truth overcomes error. When they did that, Fox put it on loop every 15 minutes when they're doing the news. Here's what the failing New York Times says. Here's what the truth was. Well, Rush Limbaugh feels obligated to only talk about it for about 3 hours in the afternoon, in which he goes on and on and on. Therefore, now they've got Reuters, and they've got BBC, and they've got CBS, and NBC, and AP, and they go on and on and on. And one piece of truth overcomes error. That's why error hates truth. They will try to destroy truth. And that's where we understand that this is a battle, and it is a spiritual battle that no one can win if God's people leave the field. Because, I repeat, God is truth. America is founded on truth. And as the scripture says, that God is the source of wisdom. So when our colleges were founded, they were all founded on biblical truth. And they all had begun the day with chapel, all the way up through the 1920s. And so Harvard, for example, where does truth come from? Veritas e Christo Ecclesia. Truth is Christ and his church. That was the motto of Harvard. Well, the point is, in reference to Christ, that's going to be a struggle. So they began to eliminate that about 40-some years ago. And the motto for Harvard ever since has been Veritas, the Latin term for truth. And so anybody who goes to Harvard loves to wear their Harvard ties, and it has the little shield and it says Veritas on it. Everybody understands that. Well, where's truth come from? Satan doesn't like truth. So they inaugurated a new president last April, and she, naturally, gave an inaugural address. Allow me to read one paragraph from her inaugural address. The president of Harvard said this: "The Veritas in Harvard's shield was originally intended to invoke the absolutes of divine revelation, the unshakable verities of the Puritan religion. We understand it quite differently now. Truth is an aspiration, not a possession. Yet as we, now get this, we, defined by the spirit of debate and free inquiry, challenge and threaten those who would embrace unquestioned certainties." See, as long as you say that God is a tree and that I'm 3 men and 2 women all on the same day, then that's fine. But if you have a certainty that comes, then we will threaten to destroy you, because error cannot tolerate truth. And in the course of this spiritual confrontation, it's important that we have those who fear God, who are men of truth, and then the final conclusion is this, and we'll go through this more quickly. That is that God said, these are the 3 things that you look for. And the bottom one is hating covetousness. Now, what is covetousness? Covetousness says that I want what you have. That's often referred to as socialism. Socialism, and let me explain, because people do not know. When you grow up on a farm, you understand all this. But in the 1930s, we went from more people living in cities than on the farm. In 1970, when I was young, 10% of the people in America produced food and fiber. It's now 2% of Americans produce food and fiber. By the way, they produce twice as much as the 10% produced in 1970, because that's what freedom does. It creates abundance. But nevertheless, there's a discontinuance as to how that works. So when I speak to college campuses, I often start the question is that how is wealth created? How do you create? And well, you know, the white power structure and the men and the patriarchy. I'm not asking about that. How is wealth created? Well, the people, the elite, and the banks. You know, and so I just let them do that for 8 or 10, 12 minutes, and finally I say, all right, stop. It's apparent there's not a person in this room who has the slightest clue as to how wealth is created. So therefore, I'm going to explain it. And that way we don't get into arguments because they don't know. And most people don't know. Let me explain. If there's a car going down the street out here, there's only two ways that I can get money out of that person's car. Only two. One is called free enterprise. And in free enterprise, I figure out ways how to do something good for that person, how to bless them such that when they come by, they slam on their brakes and they pull in and say, you're going to clean my car and make it all nice and take the dust off the dashboard and sweep it all out and do. I'd much rather have that than have this $10 bill. I'd much rather have that pair of shoes than this $50. A global position. I'll never get lost again. I would much rather have that than have this $200. And under free enterprise, we lay awake nights trying to figure out ways to do something good for someone such that a person voluntarily, freely dictates what is produced in what quantity and what quality. Not some government bureaucrat. The marketplace determines as to what they want. And you might think it's the greatest thing in the world. And the marketplace says, I don't want it. And it doesn't produce. And so in America, 4% of the population of the world, we produce more books, more plays, more symphonies, more copyrights, more inventions than the other 96% combined. Why? Because of the freedom of the capacity to do that. Here's the significance of that. The greater the blessing, the greater the reward. So you give a person 5 cups of coffee, that's one reason, 5,000 cups of coffee, 50,000 cups of coffee. The greater the contribution, the greater the reward. When I was young, and I'm probably one of the oldest in the room, there was a thing, we had these computers, and if you took computer science, you had all these cards. And when I went to Congress, no one, this is a history lesson, people didn't like computer letters. They didn't like those computer letters. And it was right in the late 70s and early 80s, they began to having these generators, and they would see your name plugged in, and boy, people just bristled at that. And so in Capitol Hill, people didn't want any of those computers. And my predecessor didn't have one of those computers, because I remember coming in and see one of those things. Well, my goodness, no. So everything was individually typed. When I got there, I said, oh, no, we can do better than that. That is, if you're going to answer 300 of the same letters, let's figure out how to do it, and we'll keep track of them. I can look back as to how they do it at the end of the day, get a report. And all. And so literally, our office designed the first correspondence software for Washington, for Capitol Hill, so that they would be logged in the morning. I knew exactly who wrote and when, and we gave everybody a response within 24 hours, not 24 hours. We gave everyone got a response that day. If we couldn't answer their question, we acknowledged that their letter came, etc. But in order to log on, I had tape there that it was all DOS, and you had to put semicolon, button, slash, dash, and after you did all that, if you made one mistake, nope, wrong, got to do it again. After the third time, you get from the storm out of the room and forget it. And so a fella came along and said, how about if I make this little picture, this little icon, and I'll make it such that when you click on that, it will do that perfectly every time. So suddenly, instead of having to be a computer nerd, all you have to do is click on this little window, and it'll do it one after another. And suddenly, computers went from being this unbelievable, complicated science to the point that I know the date, because my first grandchild, had just turned 2. And my daughter had another child, and she had a cesarean, and so she was trying to take care of the 2-year-old and nurse and all cut up in the morning. And so I had just purchased an iPad. And I said, sweetheart, I'll be back in 2 weeks. Rather than trying to use your computer, here you can lay in bed and you can use my iPad. And so 2 weeks later, I come back and I sit down on the couch to watch the news, and this 2-year-old who can barely speak, she comes up with my iPad, snuggles up against me real big, turns her back against me, and starts punching things that she had downloaded, brought out individually, and drilled down to something she wanted to watch so she could sit there and touch her granddad while he watched the news. She could watch what she wanted to watch at age 2. At age 2. Now, that changed the world. And what was the principle a minute ago? The greater the contribution, the greater the reward. So the person that did that, Bill Gates, became the richest man on the planet. So under free enterprise, we honor people who bless other people. So we honor people that are successful. Under socialism, I said that there were 2 ways to get money out of that person's part. The only other way is that I just come and take it. You stop at the streetlight, I just come and take it. Now, When a person voluntarily makes an exchange, and I give them the GPS and they give them the $200, at the end of the exchange, they are both better off. If they're not, they don't make the exchange. So therefore, wealth is created. And let's hit it again. Farmer has a pile of wheat. Baker has 10 empty ovens. Baker says, if I had his wheat, I could make donuts in the morning for people. Farmer says, I don't need any more wheat, but if I had his money, I could put a new roof on the barn, buy a new tractor. And so the two of them come together, and they make an exchange, which at the end of the exchange, they are both better off. And if they're not, they don't make the exchange. Therefore, at the end of the exchange, they have created wealth. And that's the only way that wealth is created. And Brother Josh, those of us who are Pentecostal, we know how to do this. We say it 3 times. That is the only way. That is the only way that wealth is created. Now, by creating wealth, the farmer says, with this money, I can now hire a fella that I can now do 40 more acres and make more money so I can create a job because I am creating wealth. Now, put that aside. How else can I get money out of the car? Car's driving down the road. I just come up, stops at the street light. Fellow leans over and says, I want 50% of everything in your purse. Now, what do we call that person? We call him a criminal. Puts a gun in the window. I want 50% of everything in your purse. And so they take the money and they give it to him. Question number 1, has any wealth been created? No. Has wealth been redistributed? Yes. From the person that produced it to the person that stole it. Since no wealth was created, can the criminal create a job? No. Because the money that he has, if he were to hire a person, the person that he stole it from can no longer hire that person. So it's circular because there's been no new creation. Therefore, it's impossible for a criminal to create a job. He can redistribute some if he has enough gunpowder. Let's don't call him a criminal. Let's call him a congressman. And the congressman comes along and he says, I want 50% of everything produced in it. Has he created any wealth? No. Has he redistributed wealth? Yep. From her purse to your pocket. Can a congressman create a job? No. Not unless there is something newly created. Now, here's the significance. Under socialism, we were in Indonesia. When members of Congress go into a country, they stop at the embassy. And the ambassador brings out all of the hot dogs, and they give you a briefing of the defense attaché on the defense situation, the commercial attaché, the agricultural attaché, the political attaché. And in a matter of a couple of hours, you can know more about that country than if you lived there for 2 years. And I remember after the briefing in Jakarta, they were about to leave, and the ambassador said, watch for people standing along the side of the road for seemingly no reason, because they will throw bricks at the windows of American cars when they go by. Let me hit it again. Watch for people standing alongside the road for no reason. They will throw bricks at American cars as they go by. Question. Why? I'll tell you why. Because under socialism, the person that has, what is socialism? Let's define it. Government control of the tools of production. Government controls the farms, government controls the factories, government controls the pipelines, government controls the banks, government controls. So therefore, if a person is wealthy, let's take it back. If you want to go into that business, you can't. Because government decides who those people are. And there's a correlation between the two. Therefore, under socialism, you hate the rich. Because the rich do things that you can't do and you have no hope to do. You cannot go to Mexico and go in the oil business. You cannot develop a filling station. You can't have a pipeline. You can't haul oil in a truck. You can't, the list goes on and on and on. Mexico is socialist. And if you're not a part of the elite, very, very wealthy, then you'll crawl over cut glass and barbed wire and throw your kids in a ditch and do anything if you can just get out of there. Because under socialism, you have no hope. And you hate the rich because they're in control of things. Just as a little aside, Barack Obama grew up in Indonesia, where they hated rich people. And every time he spoke, he'd always talk about the rich and the banks. He doesn't know how people got rich because he didn't take my course on how wealth is created. He thinks he has no idea. He believes, and I'll tell you, so does the Pope and some of these other folks, that they don't know how, they think America somehow stole it from poor people. Now, I know that's silly, but they still preach that. That somehow or another poor people who have nothing, starving, have no glass in their windows and no dirt ground, that somehow or another America became rich because of them. Please. But socialism is a mental disease anyway, so you understand. So how does that, so with that understanding, what does socialism do? Socialism doesn't create wealth. It takes from those who did. So the way that they get power is to come in, and Tuesday night, I was with the president of the oil company for Venezuela, and he had to escape about 12 years ago. And I said, you got to tell me, I have struggled with this. They say that Venezuela has more oil than any nation on earth. Now, does that mean per capita or what? He said, no, more than any place. More than Saudi Arabia? Yes, more than Saudi Arabia. More than Iraq? Yeah, more than Iraq. More than the United States? More than the United States. The average person in Venezuela has lost 19 pounds in the last 18 months. There are no more dogs or cats in Venezuela. They are starving to death from a nation that was the richest nation in Latin America 15 years ago, and they elect a socialist that said, I'm going to give you something. Now remember, socialists don't create anything, so how do they do it? They have to take it from someone else. And when they take it from other people, that person is discouraged, so they don't produce. The person is rewarded for not producing, and you can only do that for so long. It sounds good on paper, and if you've got a head full of mush in the college campuses, you can sell it. But I just stop and think, you got a fellow here that makes $100, and you got a fellow here that makes nothing. And you can live comfortably on $50. And so the politician comes along and says, why shouldn't we? What would Jesus do? He would take the $50 from him and give it to the poor. That would be the noble thing to do. I'm waxing John Kasich here. So it sounds good for the first day. And this guy said, oh, wait. I get up early in the morning, I go to work, I wear myself out, I come home dirty and tired, I get $50. This guy gets up when he feels like it, sits on a park bench, doesn't do anything, he gets $50. I think I like his program better. And so he doesn't produce. So when the socialists took over in Chile and said everybody's going to be paid the same, productivity in the copper mines fell 70% in the first 30 days. Socialism creates poverty. Free enterprise, American capitalism, creates wealth. And that truth overcomes the error, and it has to be amended in college campuses to teach it otherwise. So let's walk through it very, very quickly. Covetousness, one more thing. Understand what covetousness is. I used the example last night at dinner. I grew up in Hillsboro, and in Hillsboro, I know this for a fact because one of my passions are Cadillacs. And there was a time when a Cadillac was the standard of the world. And I would ride my bicycle to the 3 Cadillacs in the place, which are the funeral homes. They had black limousines, and the way that they communicated to the city that there was a funeral that day is they would park it out in the driveway. And I would, in a summer afternoon, ride my bicycle and look at that car and say, someday I want to have a car like that. It never crossed my mind to go steal it. But in America, someday I want to have a car like that. That's covetousness is, I want to take that guy's car. I want to march into those castles in France, and I want to take what they have. And under socialism, that's what you do. You covet things. And so a very good friend of mine is the Attorney General in Costa Rica, and he and the 4 of us went, our wives went out, and we got to the restaurant to go there, and Rosa and Liz went in to eat, and Juan Edgar and I are standing there talking, leaning up against his car. Well, I'm gracious up for a while, but after a few minutes, I said, Juan Edgar, there's food in that place. There isn't any food here. Can we go? Yeah, just a minute, Bob, just a minute. No, Bob. And he would just keep talking and talking. Till finally, somewhere out of the ground, somebody materialized. And he reached in his pocket, and he gave him some money, and we went in the restaurant. Now, why did he do that? Because he has a nice car. In a nation that is in favor of covetousness, people will want to take it. That's why in America we had it posted on the wall. Thou shalt not covet. Don't talk to me about taking somebody else's. See that house? Someday I want to have a house like that. See that airplane? Someday I'm going to have an airplane like that. Never crossed our mind. Under socialism, we sell the idea we're going to take what those people have. You elect me president of Venezuela, and I'm going to take from those oil companies, and you're going to have free gas and free bread. And they did. And they reelected him overwhelmingly. And there's no money to keep the oil pumping. The thing falls apart, and everybody is now in poverty. It only works that way every time. So here we go. I am 7 minutes from being finished. So let's just walk through quickly so that you can see how that works. Let us say that this Pentecostal, I'm going to lay hands on this in a minute. If it doesn't, yeah. Yeah.
Lord Jesus, help us. You're good.
Well, you have to turn it on. Oh, I knew it was some sophisticated responsibility like that. I invented software. Do you understand? So, here's our birth certificate. They got together. By the way, it wasn't that long ago. Just so that you want to know. Abraham Lincoln was a teenager when John Adams and Jefferson died. He was replaced by Ulysses Grant from down in Claremont County. All of us have 4 grandparents. All of us have 4 grandparents. 3 of my wife's grandparents were born during the Ulysses Grant administration. So this country just got here yesterday. And so it's not like that this is, and they figured it all out. They were able to look throughout all recorded history, and they figured it out. We hold these truths, we've already talked about truths, to be self-evident, which is a gracious Jeffersonian way of saying any idiot ought to understand this, bozo. You'd be blind, deaf, and dumb. You ought to be, this is self-evident. That all men are created. They didn't just crawl out of the primordial slime and say, let's write a symphony. No, they said all men are created equal and are endowed by a 5-4 decision of the Supreme Court. And we discussed it last night. Where do rights come from? Democrats believe that rights come from the people, from the democracy, that the majority makes the rights. So that when Nancy Pelosi walked up to the well of the House and grabbed the well of the House as they're voting on Obamacare, she said, today we are going to create a right to health care. If you can create a right, you can eliminate a right. There's a term for that, by the way. It's called tyranny. So therefore, our rights do not come from the majority. That's why America, as was mentioned earlier, is not a democracy. The word democracy does not appear in any of our founding documents because there was a democracy going on at the same time, and that was in France, where the mobs were making the laws, and what do they do without God? I don't have time for all that today. The bottom line is that our rights come from Him, Creator, as we said last night. It's a synonym for Christ or for God, Creator, and that among those are life. So for anybody that says, well, that's above my pay grade, and I don't want to get involved in that, and I believe it's between a woman and a doctor, and I don't want government involved in the bedroom, you're in the wrong country, honey. Because the purpose of the United States government, it says right there in our birth certificate, to secure these rights. To secure these rights, the purpose of the United States government, I'll repeat it, the purpose of the United States government is to protect life. Then liberty. Notice the sequence. Liberty is of precious little value if you're dead. You have to have life first, then liberty, then sewer systems and overpasses. But the first thing that you do is life. So anybody that wants to tell you, well, I don't think that's any of your business, or I don't want to be involved in that, or I don't think a school board has anything to do with it. Yes, it does. In America, the only reason we have government is to protect life. Now get this as an aside. You say, well, I think you right-wingers are too concerned about that. I mean, I let it go. I mean, Congress has already spoken, and can't you just let it go? No. Anybody who will take innocent life, anyone who will take innocent life will not hesitate to take your liberty. That's a piece of cake. I'll take your gun in a New York minute. If I kill your daughter, my goodness, why taking your gun be simple? So that tells you what you need to know. Begins with God. So first of all, if they don't like God, now you know there's going to... So first of all, they have to believe in God and then protect life. And hating covetousness, which is wanting what... Now, how does this work? It works like this. Let us suppose that this represents 100% of your income, 100% of the income of any city or state or a nation. Let us say it represents a $100 bill. And you go into Walmart, and the most expensive thing in the Walmart is $95. That means you are completely free to choose anything in the store. Let us suppose someone comes along and takes 25% of it away from you. Two things happen. There are some things you can no longer choose. You have fewer choices. Thomas Jefferson said freedom is having choices. The more choices I take away from you, the less freedom you had. Anybody ever raised a teenager who's had this argument? So when I take money away from you, you have fewer choices and a lower standard of living. Like I say, if you're not with the New York Times, this is apparent. If you're with the New York Times, when you say, I take money away from you, you're worse off, that would be a profundity for them. But nevertheless, when I take money away, you have fewer choices, less freedom. Suppose someone comes along and takes 50%. What happens? Fewer choices, less freedom. So if someone comes along and takes 75, leaves you with 25. What happens? You're now poorer, a lower... Suppose someone comes along and takes it all. What do we call a person who works all day long, keeps absolutely nothing? That person is called a slave. Now, there are only two people that can come and take money away from you. One is called a criminal, has a gun, can take money away from you. The other is called the government, has a gun, and can take money away from you. Here's the point. The impact is the same. So you go to the pay window, you pick up your money, you're walking across the parking lot, you're on your way to your truck, a fella comes up, puts a gun in your ribs, says, I want 50% of everything you got. You go home, you sit down with your wife and children, this is how much money we have, this is how much we have for food and clothing and shelter and vacations and college, this is all we have. Or you make it all the way to your truck, you open it up, you see that Uncle Sam's already been here. It's half already gone. You sit up, the impact is the same. Therefore, you show me what percentage of the GDP, the gross domestic product, the goods and services produced by any city, any state, or any nation. And the principle applies. The greater the freedom, the greater the wealth, the greater the government, the greater the poverty. And that's all politics is. Yep. Which direction do you go on this chart? And you go back and forth and back and forth. So, Britain was in a state of collapse in the 1970s. Margaret Thatcher came in and cut taxes. By the time she left, it was the fourth largest GDP in the world. When I was a member of the legislature in Columbus, Ohio was #1 in new job creation. We elected folks change. We can put a stop to this. And so during the course of tax increases such that when John Kasich became governor of Ohio, out of the 50 states, Ohio had gone from #1 to 49th. And for the first time in history, Ohio Buckeyes were saying, thank God for Michigan. That's all politics is. Now, if you understand it, you don't need to fear it. You can make any rich place poor, or you can make any poor place rich. A couple of quick examples. Let's just jump through them. That is, there's the principle, and I like to use this example. You could use lots of them. I majored in economics, by the way. And so they explained to us the reason Americans were rich was because we had lots of natural resources and temperate climate, and we're hardworking people, blah, 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 blah. Okay, so let's just take this. This is the same heritage, the same culture, the same climate, the same language, and you can't blame it on its neighbors because it's a peninsula. When they divided the country, the 38th parallel, North Korea got socialism, 75% of the arable land. South Korea got all the refugees, all the mountains, and 25% of the arable land. Over the last 5 years, 2.5 million people up here have starved. They are now significantly shorter than they were 40 years ago. They eat sticks and leaves to keep their stomachs full. They walk around bent up. South Korea, same heritage, culture, climate, language, has the 10th largest GDP in the world. What's the difference? One got freedom and one got socialism. It doesn't have to do with the weather, and it has to do with the politics. Now, at the same time that South Korea, when it was at the end of the war, it was third from the bottom of all the nations on earth. Third from the bottom. And it's now number 10. Probably can't get much higher because there's only so many of them. I mean, but you and I are doing our best. We got our TV and our telephones and everything from them. We're trying to help them out. But at the same time that they were third from the bottom, the richest spot on the planet, the richest spot in the history of mankind, and it wasn't close either, by 18%, nearly a fifth. The richest spot in the history of the world was a place called Detroit, Michigan. And in Detroit, Michigan, they voted for change. They elected a racist as the governor, as the mayor. And he began to attack people based upon not the fact that God had made them, but because of their skin color. And then they began to tax them. Now, if you're going through an intersection, and every time you come to that intersection, somebody comes along and surrounds your car and takes half your money, how long before you quit going to that intersection? Well, they do that in Detroit. People leave. Population of Detroit is now lower than it was in 1900, the turn of the 19th century. But nevertheless, in Japan, which is just across the way, they had an encounter with the United States. They brought it upon themselves. And we decided to end the war, and so we turned Nagasaki into this. And when Nagasaki looked like this, Detroit was a paradise. There are more three-story single-family houses in Detroit than ever will be in the history of the world. But as I said, we voted for people, said we can put a stop to this, and they did. And so there's the way that Nagasaki looks today after freedom, and the Americans brought it in. And when Nagasaki looked like that and Detroit was so rich, this is what Detroit looks like now. This, by the way, was considered the most elaborate, most beautiful public building in the world. The people it was just dedicated 100 years ago, and it's the train station in Detroit. And people, when they came to America, it was part of the trip that they wanted to make sure that they went through Detroit, and they could see the murals on the wall and how beautiful this train station was. But these folks said, we don't care about those things because free enterprise takes care of it. There are now 48,000 single-family dwellings that are not inhabited or uninhabitable in the city of Detroit. You know who's number 2? Cleveland. Buffalo and Philadelphia are hanging in there. This is what socialism does. It only does this every time. This is the way it works. Now, I can explain why that is. I don't think we have time for it. Let's just proceed through it here. And we'll save it for another time. And that's our hero there. So we'll go on. So let us conclude that, and there's the picture of President Washington. We've been in bad times before. I told you about the one when we started here. We hit other times after that, at the end of the Civil War. America was almost finished with slavery. Just as a little aside, I often ask people, let's talk about America's evil and its sin and all that sort of thing. When they tried to put America together, they tried to do things that nobody had ever done before. And so 50% of the people lived in 3 states and 50% lived in 10 states, and there's no way around that. And 5 states had slavery and others hated slavery, and how are you going to get these people all work together? And the soldiers that I told you about that are hanging on to get paid, they'd never been paid. And so what they did is they took the Northwest Territory, which is Ohio and Indiana, Illinois, and they said, we'll give you pieces of land, and that's because we don't have any cash. And so they gave them land. I represent Clinton County. One of the grants was to a Carey. Rita Carey is the editor of the newspaper. Ron Carey is the county prosecutor. And they gave one to a Fife. BDM Fife is the county commissioner, and Bill Fife is the county auditor down in Clinton County. And these were revolutionary soldiers that got land. And one of the provisions they passed unanimously was that you could have no slavery in the new territory. 100%, everybody agreed. Well, the representatives to the Constitutional Convention from South Carolina and North Carolina said, oh boy, this is going to be a challenge. We're going to have to go back and tell them that they're supposed to sign up with this new country, but the second they sign up with it, they're going to be out of business. So we got to come up with a compromise, and they began to fall apart, as you may recall. And George Washington crowded them all back together. Benjamin Franklin, one of only 4 that had been in that same room 11 years earlier when they wrote the Declaration of Independence, he now spoke for the first time. Everybody stopped to listen. He was considered the most respected man on the planet. More people knew his name than anybody else in the world. And he got up to speak, and he said, folks, I'm an old man. But one thing I've learned is that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall without his notice, is it probable that an empire could rise without his aid? So we've been instructed in the sacred writings, except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain, they build it. Well, I believe this. We're going to be no more successful in this political building than were the buildings of Babel. He said, when we were in the battle, in the fight with Great Britain, we had daily prayer in this room. Our prayers were heard, and they were graciously answered. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need him? Mr. President, I move that we recess for 3 days of fasting and prayer. Let's see what God might do. And then begin each day with prayer. And so they did. They came back, met the following Monday morning. The prayer was published in the Philadelphia paper, a brief little prayer, 3.5 hours on their knees. And in the course of the next 5 weeks, they wrote the Constitution of the United States, the oldest government on the planet. Every government on earth has changed repeatedly since then. It's been available as a template, but none of it is still the apex in human government. And they said, this is a good thing. Therefore, Congress shall never meet without first calling upon God in prayer. And Congress has never met from that day until this. Let us recognize from which our strength comes. So we're going to put under God. We're going to put in God we trust on all of our money, unless people think that's where it comes from. And we're going to begin with prayer. We're going to mention God in all our official documents. If you take a position of public trust, you must swear allegiance to the Bible. And we know what has happened as a consequence from that country. The way they resolve the population, we're going to treat all of you states equal. Everybody gets 2 senators. Big states, all right, you can have more people in the House of Representatives. Now, slavery. What are we going to do about that? Well, they came up with a solution. And I often ask black professors when they're wailing against America, and I say, when was the slave trade ended? Do you know I've never had anybody answer it yet? It's hidden, a place where nobody would ever find it. It's in the Constitution of the United States. And it says that the slave trade, the importation, cannot take place for 20 years. So in other words, if you sign up, South Carolina, and you become a part of the United States, the question is not whether or not we're going to get rid of slavery. The question is whether or not there's going to be a United States. So if we get the United States, then you got 20 years to get through this, and then once you do it, then you're out of business. And so 1787, 1797, 1807, the slave trade, you could not import any more slaves to America beginning on January 1st, 1808, in an act of Congress signed by the President of the United States, Thomas Jefferson. That ended it. Now we got it quarantined. Now it's going to die. Now they're becoming increasingly valuable because there's fewer of them, and they're all going to disappear, and it's just about dead. Until 1828. And our first genuine slave trader, a fellow who bought slaves down in New Orleans, brought them up and sold them on the Tennessee River, becomes President of the United States. He defeats John Quincy Adams, who dedicated his entire life to ending slavery. If you haven't watched the movie Amistad, you should. He dedicated his life. He hated slavery. And he went, after he got defeated as president, he went to Congress. And he introduced a bill every day to end slavery. And finally they said, John, we got the idea. And so they passed what is called the Adams Rule. And the Adams Rule is you only introduce it once. We got the message. I mean, there we can refer to it. You don't need to do it every day. And it's still in effect to this day. And he died on the floor of the House of Representatives. And that person who got elected in 1828 had the Compromise of 1830, which for the first time opened it up and brought in a slave state. And now we have what is called the Jacksonian era, from 1830 to 1860, in which there's a fight back and forth and back and forth. And Henry Clay, who hated slavery, and Daniel Webster, who hated slavery, and these Whigs are fighting these Democrats who are in favor of slavery and dedicated to slavery, and they're going back and forth until finally the campaign manager for Andrew Jackson, who he appointed as Attorney General of the United States. He then puts him on the Supreme Court, and he becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And they finally say, and by the way, there's a direct correlation here. Lincoln said, people say, well, if you don't want to have a slave, don't have one. He said, but in order to preserve an injustice, you have to take away my freedom. So what do you mean? Well, for one thing, if you're opposing slavery, they call that insurrection. You're violating the government rules of the United States. So therefore, they got the right to open your mail. So you lost free access to your mail in order for them to preserve their loss of liberty. And the Democrat Party was dedicated to the loss of liberty forever and ever and ever. Now you're going to find out in my story here in a second how we ended that. And then they went after life. And now they're going after life. And the same thing. You say, well, if you don't want to have an abortion, don't have one. No. You can't have an insurance policy that doesn't allow for abortion. And you can't speak out. You can see how once that evil takes place, then it incorporates all of us. And so we go back, and finally in 1857, when they said they passed the fugitive slave law in 1850, and they took a fellow, Dred Scott, and they took away his freedom. He lived up north, and what they had the right to do was come up north where people hated slavery and come up and say, I think you're my slave, or I think you're somebody else's slave. You come with me. And the guy had no rights, which made Republicans furious. So they went to court, and the court said in 1857, how do you resolve this? There's only one way you can say it. Black people aren't people. They're chairs. The Dred Scott decision says that their property can be bought and sold like furniture. And so, sure enough, John Kasich said, well, the courts have spoken. That's the way, that's the law of the land. That's the way it is. There's nothing we can do. And the Whig Party says, we've fought this thing long enough, and we can't, the court has spoken. It's all decided. And the Whig Party said, we've spent 30 years fighting this, and we're not going to do it anymore. And the Whig Party, in a matter of about 18 months, collapsed. And a group of people got together and formed the Republican Party, dedicated to one purpose, and that is ending slavery. And the court, they then took off such that in 1860, they elected a president. They elected a president in November, and January, February, March, he took office on March 3rd. By the time he got president of the United States, 7 of those states said, we're out of here. We know this doesn't work. We know what they're going to do. They're going to take that thing and they're going to apply it to us. And we can't do that. And so we then fought that. And we had a victory, and then now blacks are going to be treated equally, and we think that's really wonderful. And then we look over our shoulder and find out they're not doing it. And so we have to amend the Constitution. Article 14 say equal protection, that everybody gets treated the same. All the Republicans voted for it. Not one single Democrat voted for it. Well, you think, all right, now they're going to be treated equally. No, that'll solve that problem. Well, they said, well, if you're black, then you have to pass this test, you have to own this much property, and you have to do the multiplication table blindfolded, and they came up with all this stuff, and so therefore blacks were not allowed to vote. And so they passed the 15th Amendment, which the history books say gave blacks the right to vote. No, it didn't. No, it didn't. Blacks had the right to vote originally, back when Paul Revere went on his charge. His compatriot that went north, Paul Revere went east, was black. And that man was elected 22 times during the course of his lifetime. Blacks have always voted in America. Blacks have always been elected. In Democrat states, they were not allowed to. And so what does the amendment say? It doesn't say it gives blacks the right to vote. It says, no state shall prohibit. In other words, quit it. And you know how many Democrats voted for the 15th Amendment? 0. And so to this day, in every county in America, Democrats have what are called Jackson Day dinners. Right here in Circleville, they have Jackson Day. In Chillicothe, they have Jackson Day dinners. Every county in America also has a Lincoln Day dinner in which they celebrate freedom and equal opportunity. We don't go around and check their skin color and their race and all that. We just treat everybody the same regardless. That is called a republic, and to the republic for which it stands. When they came out of the Constitutional Convention, Dr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it. And so, in the course of that, as I mentioned, at the same time, they were having the French Revolution. They wanted to have liberty, but notice there's no God involved. Without God, your rights come from the group. The group wants equality. How do you get equality? You take from one person, give to another. What happens when they take from one person and give it? The people you take it from object. When they object, what do? You have to kill them. So Pol Pot killed 2 million in Cambodia. Soviet Union, they killed 85 million over the course of 70 years. Over 100 million under the communists in China, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Therefore, what is this battle all about? We need God. He's our source. We focus on people that do Him. Then we have truth that comes with Him, and then haters of socialism. This is what I want you to say. I want to conclude with this. At the time, there were 11 years between America got its independence. We had 13 individual countries, 13 individual foreign policies, 13 individual currencies. It wasn't working well. And so the only person they really trusted was George Washington, and so George Washington invited them all back to the same place where they'd written the Declaration 11 years before, and they tried to put together this agreement. And because what really sparked it was that farmers in South Carolina went up to Charlotte, which is just across the border in North Carolina, and wanted to buy grain, and they wouldn't take the South Carolinian money, and so the farmers rioted and took the seed corn anyway, and the thing has fallen apart in that regard, and so they're back there and they're trying to form a government. And the money is worthless. To this day, you'll hear people say it's not worth a continental. That means a continental dollar was worthless. It had no value. When they wrote the Constitution, one of the provisions they made was that every year the president shall, from time to time, provide reports on the state of the Union. And so, on the third State of the Union address, on the third year of being an American, here's what George Washington said. Now remember, the American currency was worthless, it was of no value. He said, "The United States enjoy a scene of tranquility and prosperity under the new government that could hardly have been hoped for. Our public credit now stands at that high ground which 3 years ago it would have been considered a species of madness to have foretold." In other words, if I would have told you 3 years ago that America would be the strongest currency in the world, you would have said I was crazy. But that's what happens. Bob, what's your point? My point is, if you do the wrong things, you can screw up a great city or a great country. But if you do the right things, you can fix it rapidly, rapidly. And the country is crying out for us. We can run the worst campaigns in the world. He still gave us victory. There are more conservatives in Congress than any time in the history of the United States. It's the high water mark is when Calvin Coolidge was president. We're at that level in the House and also in the Senate. 34 governors. The country is screaming for our leadership. They want us to do what we can do, and all we have to do is step forward and get it and take for it. And that's why you're here. That's why I respect you for doing it. It's been an honor to be with you. God bless.